Hi, my name is Riva Villa. I am the director for the Shelton Upward Bound program and the instructor for the bridge class for the summer program of 2020. I will be reading sections from The Conquest of New Spain by Bernal Diaz. Specifically, the chapters that I will be reading are The Entrance into Mexico and The Stay in Mexico. And the purpose of this reading will be specifically for the instruction of the bridge program class. Students are reading The Conquest of New Spain for the summer program in the bridge class, and the whole point of this is to give them access to the book, audio access to the books that we've already bought for students. So this is the entrance into Mexico. Early next day, we left Iztapalapa with a large escort of these great caciques and followed the causeway, which is 8 yards wide and goes straight into the city of Mexico, that I do not think it curves at all. Wide though it was so crowded with people that there was hardly room for them all. Some were going to Mexico and others coming away, besides those who had come out to see us, and we could hardly get through the crowds that were there. For the towers and the quays were full, and they came in canoes from all parts of the lake. No wonder, since they had never seen horses or men like us before. With such wonderful sights to gaze on, we did not know what to say, or if this was real that we saw before our eyes. On the land side, there were great cities, and on the lake many more. The lake was crowded with canoes. At intervals along the causeway, there were many bridges, and before us was the great city of Mexico. As for us, we were scarcely 400 strong, and we well remembered the words and warnings of the people of Huexotzinco and Tlaxcala and Lamanalco, and the other many warnings we had received to be aware of entering the city of Mexico, since they would kill us as soon as they had us inside. Let the interested reader consider whether there is naught to ponder in this narrative of mine. What men in all the world have shown such daring? But let us go on. We marched along our causeway to a point where another small causeway branches off to another city called Coyoacan. And there, beside some tower-like buildings, which were their shrines, we were met by many more caciques and dignitaries in very rich cloaks. The different chieftains wore different brilliant liveries, and the causeways were full of them. Montezuma had sent these great caciques in advance to receive us, and as soon as they came before Cortés, they told him in their language that we were welcome, and as a sign of peace, they touched the ground with their hands and kissed it. There we halted for some time, while Cacamatzin, the lord of Texcoco, and the lords of Iztapalapa, Tacuba, and Coyoacan, went ahead to meet the great Montezuma, who approached in a rich litter, accompanied by other great lords and feudal caciques who owned vassals. When we came near to Mexico, at a place where there were some other small towers, the great Montezuma descended from his litter, and these other great caciques supported him beneath a marvelously rich canopy of green feathers, decorated with gold work, silver, pearls, and chachahuites, which hung from a sort of border. It was a marvelous sight. The great Montezuma was magnificently clad in their fashion and wore sandals of a kind for which their name is cutaras. The footnote says actually a Cuban word. The Mexican word is catli. The soles of which are gold, and the upper parts ornamented with precious stones. And the four lords who supported him were richly clad also in garments that seemed to have been kept ready for them on the road, so that they could accompany their master. For they had not worn clothes like this when they came out to receive us. There were 4 other great caciques who carried the canopy above their heads, and many more lords who walked before the great Montezuma, sweeping the ground on which he was to tread, and laying down cloaks so that his feet should not touch the earth. Not one of these chieftains dared look him in the face. All kept their eyes lowered most reverently, except those 4 lords, his nephews, who were supporting him. When Cortés saw, heard, and was told that the great Montezuma was approaching, he dismounted from his horse, and when he came near to Montezuma, each bowed deeply to the other. Montezuma welcomed our captain, and Cortés, speaking through Doña Merina, asking by wishing him very good health, by wishing him very good health. Cortés, I think, offered Moctezuma his right hand, but Moctezuma refused it and extended his own. Then Cortés of those elaborately worked I skipped a line, sorry. Then Cortés brought out a necklace which he had been holding. It was made of those elaborately worked and colored glass beads called margaritas, of which I had spoken, and was strung on a gold cord and dipped in musk to give it a good odor. This he hung round the great Moctezuma's neck. And as he did so, he attempted to embrace him. But the great princes who stood around Moctezuma grasped Cortés' arms to prevent him, for they considered this an indignity. Then Cortés told Moctezuma that it rejoiced his heart to have seen such a great prince, and that he took his coming in person to receive him and the repeated favors he had done him as a high honor. After this, Montezuma made him another complimentary speech and ordered 2 of his nephews, who were supporting him, the lords of Texcoco and Coyoacan, to go with us to show us our quarters. Montezuma returned to the city with the other 2 kinsmen of his escort and the lords of Cuitlahuac and Tacuba, and all those grand companies of caciques and dignitaries who had come with him to return also in his train. And as they accompanied their lord, we observed them marching with their eyes downcast so that they should not see him, and keeping close to the wall as they followed him with great reverence. Thus space was made for us to enter the streets of Mexico without being pressed by the crowd. Who could now count the multitude of men, women, and boys in the streets, on the rooftops and in canoes on the waterways, who had come out to see us? It was a wonderful sight, and as I write, it all comes before my eyes as if it happened only yesterday. They led us to our quarters, which were in some large houses capable of accommodating us all, and had formerly belonged to the great Moctezuma's father, who was called Axayacatl. Here, Montezuma now kept the great shrines of his gods and a secret chamber containing gold bars and jewels. This was the treasure he had inherited from his father, which he never touched. Perhaps the reason for lodging us here was that, since they called us teules and considered us as such, they wished to have us near their idols. In any case, they took us to this place where there were many great halls, and a dais hung with the cloth of their country for our captain, and matting beds with canopies over them for each of us. On our arrival, we entered the large court where the great Montezuma was awaiting our captain. Taking him by the hand, the prince led him to his apartment in the hall where he was to lodge, which was very richly furnished in their manner. Montezuma had ready for him a very rich necklace made of golden crabs, a marvelous piece of work, which he hung around Cortés' neck. His captains were greatly astonished at this sign of honor. After this ceremony, for which Cortés had thanked him through our interpreters, Montezuma said, "Malinche, you and your brothers are in your own house. Rest a while." He then returned to his palace, which was not far off. We divided our lodgings by companies and placed our artillery in a convenient spot. Then the order we were to keep was clearly explained to us, and we were warned to be very much on the alert, both the horsemen and the rest of us soldiers. We then ate a sumptuous dinner, which they had prepared for us in their native style. So, with luck on our side, we boldly entered the city of Tenochtitlan, or Mexico, on 8 November in the year of our Lord, 1519. The stay in Mexico. When the great Montezuma had dined and was told that our captain and all of us had finished our meal some time ago, he came to our quarters in the grandest state with a great number of princes, all of them his kinsmen. On being told of his approach, Cortés came into the middle of the hall to receive him. Montezuma then took him by the hand, and they brought chairs made in their fashion and very richly decorated in various ways with gold. Montezuma requested our captain to sit down, and both of them sat, each on his own chair. Then Montezuma began a very good speech, saying that he was delighted to have such valiant gentlemen as Cortés and the rest of us in his house and his kingdom. That 2 years ago he had received news of a captain who had come to Chopoton, and that last year he had also received a report of another captain who had come with 4 ships. Each time he had wished to see them, and now that he had us with him, he was not only at our service, but would share all that he possessed with us. He ended by saying that we must truly be the men about whom his ancestors had long ago prophesied, saying that they would come from the direction of the sunrise to rule over these lands, and that he was confirmed in this belief by the valor with which we had fought at Champoton and Tabasco, and against the Tlaxcalans, for lifelike pictures of these battles had been brought to him. Cortés replied through our interpreters that we did not know how to repay the daily favors we received from him, and that indeed we did come from the direction of the sunrise, and were vassals and servants of a great king called the Emperor Charles, who was a ruler over many great princes. Having heard news of Montezuma and what a great prince he was, the emperor, he said, had sent us to this country to visit him and to beg them to become Christians like our emperor and all of us, so that his soul and those of all his vassals might be saved. Cortés promised to explain to him later how this could be and how we worshipped one true God and who he is. Also many other good things which he had already communicated to his ambassadors Tendile, Pitalpitoque, and Quitolbor. The great Montezuma had some fine gold jewels of various shapes and readiness, which he gave to Cortés after this conversation. And to each of our captains he presented small gold objects and 3 loads of cloaks of rich featherwork. And to us soldiers he gave 2 loads of cloaks each, all with a princely air. For in every way he was like a great prince. After the distribution of presents, he asked Cortés if we were all brothers and vassals of our great emperor. And Cortés answered that we were brothers in love and friendship, persons of great distinction, and servants of our great king and lord. Further polite speeches passed between Montezuma and Cortés, but as this was the first time he had visited us, and we did not want to tire him, the conversation ended. Montezuma had ordered his stewards to provide us with everything we needed for our way of living. Maize, grindstones, women to make our bread, fowls, fruit, and plenty of fodder for the horses. He then took leave of all of us with the greatest courtesy, and we accompanied him to the street. However, Cortés ordered us not to go far from our quarters for the present, until we knew better what conduct to observe. Next day, Cortés decided to go to Montezuma's palace, but first he sent to know whether the prince was busy and to inform him of our coming. He took 4 captains with him, Pedro de Alvarado, Juan Velázquez de León, Diego de Ordaz, and Gonzalo de Sandoval, and 5 of us soldiers. When Montezuma was informed of our coming, he advanced into the middle of the hall to receive us, closely surrounded by his nephews, for no other chiefs were allowed to enter his palace or communicate with him except upon important business. Cortés and Montezuma exchanged bows and clasped hands. Then Montezuma led Cortés to his own dais, and setting him down on his right, called for more seats, on which he ordered us all to sit also. Cortés began to make a speech through our interpreters, saying that we were all now rested, and that in coming to see and speak with such a great prince, we had fulfilled the purpose of our voyage and the orders of our lord the king. The principal things he had come to say on behalf of our Lord God had already been communicated to Montezuma through his 3 ambassadors on that occasion in the sandhills when he did us the favor of sending us the golden moon and sun. We had then told him that we were Christians and worshipped one God alone, named Jesus Christ, who had suffered his passion and death to save us, and that what they worshipped as gods were not gods but devils, which were evil things. And if they were ugly to look at, their deeds were uglier. But he proved to them how evil and ineffectual their gods were, as both the prince and his people would observe in the course of time, since where we had put up crosses such as their ambassadors had seen, they had been too frightened to appear before them. The favor he now begged of the great Montezuma was that he should listen to the words he now wished to speak. Then he very carefully expounded the creation of the world, how we are all brothers, the children of one mother and father called Adam and Eve, and how such a brother as our great emperor, grieving for the perdition of so many souls as their idols were leading them to hell, where they burnt in living flame, had sent us to tell him this, so that he might put a stop to it, and so that they might give up the worship of idols and make no more human sacrifices, for all men are brothers, and commit no more robbery or sodomy. He also promised that in the course of time the king would send some men who lead holy lives among us, much better than our own, to explain this more fully, for we had only come to give them warning. Therefore he begged Montezuma to do as he was asked. As Montezuma seemed about to reply, Cortes broke off his speech, saying to those of us who were with him, "Since this is only the first attempt, we have now done our duty." "My lord Malinche," Montezuma replied, "these arguments of yours have been familiar to me for some time. I understand what you said to my ambassadors on the sandhills about the three gods and the cross, and also what you preached in the various towns through which you passed. We have given you no answer, since we have worshipped our own gods from the beginning and know them to be good. No doubt yours are good also, but do not trouble to tell us any more about them at present. Regarding the creation of the world, we have held the same belief for many ages, and for this reason are certain that you are those who our ancestors predicted would come from the direction of the sunrise. As for your great king, I am in his debt and will give him of what I possess. For, as I have already said, 2 years ago I had news of the captains who came in ships by the road that you came, and said that they were servants of this great king of yours. I should like to know if you are all the same people." Cortes answered that we were all brothers and servants of the emperor, and that they had come to discover a route and explore the seas and ports, so that when they knew them well, we could follow, as we had done. Montezuma was referring to the expeditions of Francisco Hernandez de Cordoba and of Grijalva, the first voyages of discovery. He said that ever since that time he had wanted to invite some of these men to visit the cities of this kingdom, where he would receive them and do them honor, and that now his gods had fulfilled his desire, for we were in his house, which we might call our own. Here we might rest and enjoy ourselves, for we should receive good treatment. If on other occasions he had sent to forbid our entrance in the city, it was not of his own free will, but because his vassals were afraid. For they told him we shot out flashes of lightning and killed many Indians with our horses, and that we were angry teules, and other such childish stories. But now that he had seen us, he knew that we were of flesh and blood and very intelligent, also very brave. Therefore he had a far greater esteem for us than these reports had given him, and would share with us what he had. We all thanked him heartily for this signal of goodwill, and Montezuma replied with a laugh, because in his princely matter he spoke very gaily. "Malinche, I know that these people of Tlaxcala, with whom you are so friendly, have told you that I am a sort of god or teule, and keep nothing in any of my houses that is not made of silver and gold and precious stones. But I know very well that you are too intelligent to believe this and will take it as a joke. See now, Malinche, my body is made of flesh and blood like yours, and my houses and palaces are of stone, wood, and plaster. It is true that I am a great king and have inherited the riches of my ancestors, but the lies and nonsense you have heard of us are not true. You must take them as a joke, as I take the story of your thunders and lightnings." Cortes answered also with a laugh that enemies always speak evil and tell lies about people they hate, but he knew he could not hope to find any more magnificent prince in that land, and there was a good reason why his fame should have reached our emperor. While this conversation was going on, Montezuma quietly sent one of his nephews, a great cacique, to order his stewards to bring certain pieces of gold, which had apparently been set aside as gifts for Cortes, and 10 loads of fine cloaks, which he divided, the gold and cloaks between Cortes and the 4 captains, and for each of us soldiers 2 gold necklaces, each worth 10 pesos, and 2 loads of cloaks. The gold that he then gave us was worth in all more than 10,000 worth more than 1,000 pesos, and he gave it all cheerfully, like a great and valiant prince. As it was now past midday, and he did not wish him to be importunate, Cortes said to Montezuma, "My lord, the favors you do us increase load by load every day, and it is now the hour of your dinner. Montezuma answered us that he thanked us for visiting him. We then took our leave with the greatest courtesy and returned to our quarters, talking as we went of the prince's fine breeding and manners, and deciding to show him the greatest respect in every way, and to remove our quilted caps in his presence, which we always did. The great Montezuma was about 40 years old, of good height, well proportioned, spare and slight, and not very dark, though of the usual Indian complexion. He did not wear his hair long, but just over his ears, and he had a short black beard, well shaped and thin. His face was rather long and cheerful. He had fine eyes, and in his appearance and manner could express geniality or, when necessary, a serious composure. He was very neat and clean, and took a bath every afternoon. He had many women as his mistresses, the daughters of chieftains, but two legitimate wives who were caciques in their own right. And when he had intercourse with any of them, it was so secret that only some of his servants knew about it. He was quite free from sodomy. The clothes he wore one day he did not wear again until 3 or 4 days later. He had a guard of 200 chieftains lodged in rooms beside his own, only some of whom were permitted to speak to him. When they entered his presence, they were compelled to take off their rich cloaks and put on others of little value. They had to be clean and walk barefoot with their eyes downcast, for they were not allowed to look him in the face, and as they approached, they had to make 3 obeisances, saying as they did so, Lord, my great Lord." Then, when they had said what they had come to say, he would dismiss them with very few words. They did not turn their backs on him as they went out, but kept their faces toward him and their eyes downcast, only turning around when they had left the room. Another thing I noticed was that when other great chiefs came from distant lands about disputes or on business, they too had to take off their shoes and put on poor cloaks before entering Montezuma's apartments, and they were not allowed to enter the palace immediately, but had to linger for a while near the door, since to enter hurriedly was considered disrespectful. For each meal, his servants prepared him more than 30 dishes cooked in their native style, which they put over small earthenware braziers to prevent them from getting cold. They cooked more than 300 plates of food the great Montezuma was going to eat, and more than 1,000 more for the guard. I have heard that they used to cook him the flesh of young boys, but as he had such a variety of dishes made of so many different ingredients, we could not tell whether a dish was of human flesh or anything else, since every day they cooked fowls, turkeys, pheasants, local partridges, quail, tame and wild duck, venison, wild boar, marsh birds, pigeons, hares, and rabbits, also many other kinds of birds and beasts native to their country, so numerous that I cannot quickly name them all. I know for certain, however, that after our captain spoke against the sacrifice of human beings and the eating of their flesh, Montezuma ordered that it no longer be served to him. Let us now turn to the way his meals were served, which was like this. If it was cold, they built a large fire of live coals made by burning the bark of a tree which gave off no smoke. The smell of the bark from which they made these coals was very sweet. In order that he should get no more heat than he wanted, they placed a sort of screen in front of it adorned with figures of idols worked in gold. He would sit on a low, soft stool, which was richly worked. His table, which was also low and decorated in the same way, was covered with white tablecloths and rather long napkins of the same material. Then 4 very clean and beautiful girls brought water for his hands in one of those deep basins they call chicales, which are gourds. They held others like plants beneath it to catch the water, and brought him towels. 2 other women brought him maize cakes. When he began his meal, they placed in front of him a sort of wooden screen, richly decorated with gold, so that no one should see him eat. Then the 4 women retired, and the 4 great chieftains, all old men, stood beside him. He talked with them every now and then and asked them questions, and as a great favor, he would sometimes offer them a dish of whatever tasted best. They say that these were the closest relations and advisors and judges of lawsuits, and if he gave them anything to eat, they ate it standing, with deep reverence and without looking in his face. Montezuma's food was served on Cholula ware, some red and some black. While he was dining, the guards in the adjoining rooms did not dare to speak or make a noise above a whisper. His servants brought him some of every kind of fruit that grew in the country, but he ate very little of it. Sometimes they brought him in cups of pure gold a drink made from the cocoa plant, which they said he took before visiting his wives. We did not take much notice of this at the time, though I saw them bring in a good 50 large jugs of this chocolate, all frothed up, of which he would drink a little. They always served it with a great reverence. Sometimes some little humpbacked dwarfs would be present at his meals, whose bodies seemed almost to be broken in the middle. These were his jesters. There were other Indians who told him jokes and must have been his clowns, and others who sang and danced, for Montezuma was very fond of music and entertainment and would reward his entertainers with leavings of food and chocolate. The same 4 women removed the tablecloths and again most reverently brought him water for his hands. Then Montezuma would talk to these 4 old chieftains about matters that interested him, and they would take their leave with great ceremony. He stayed behind to rest. As soon as the great Montezuma had dined, all the guards and many more of his household servants ate in their turn. I think more than 1,000 plates of food must have been brought in for them, and more than 2,000 jugs of chocolate frothed up in the Mexican style, and infinite quantities of fruit, so that with his women and serving maids and bread makers and chocolate makers, his expenses must have been considerable. One thing I had forgotten to say is that 2 more very handsome women served Montezuma when he was at table with maize cakes kneaded with eggs and other nourishing ingredients. These maize cakes were very white and were brought in on plates covered with clean napkins. They brought him a different kind of bread also, and a long ball kneaded with other kinds of nourishing food, and patol cake, as they call it in that country, which is a kind of wafer. They also placed on the table 3 tubes, much painted and gilded, in which they put liquid amber mixed with some herbs, which are called tobacco. Gum of a native tree is what it says in the footnotes about liquid amber. When Montezuma had finished his dinner, and the singing and dancing were over, and the cloths have been removed, he would inhale the smoke from one of these tubes. He took very little of it, and then fell asleep. I remember that at that time his steward was a great cacique whom we named Tapia, and he kept an account of all of the revenue that was brought to Montezuma in his books, which were made of paper, their name for which is amal, and had a great house full of these books. But they have nothing to do with our story. Montezuma had 2 houses stocked with every sort of weapon. Many of them were richly adorned with gold and precious stones. There were shields large and small, and a sort of broadsword, and 2-handed swords with flint blades that cut much better than our swords, and lances longer than ours with 5-foot blades consisting of many knives. Even when these are driven at a buckler or a shield, they are not deflected. In fact, they cut like razors, and the Indians can shave their heads with them. They had very good bows and arrows, and double and single-pointed javelins, as well as their throwing sticks and many slings and round stones shaped by hand, and another sort of shield that can be rolled up when they are not fighting so that it does not get in the way, but which can be opened when they need it in battle and covers their bodies from head to foot. There was also a great deal of cotton armor richly worked on the outside with different colored feathers, which they used as devices and distinguishing marks. And they had casques and helmets made of wood and bone, which were also highly decorated with feathers on the outside. They had other arms of different kinds, which I will not mention through fear of prolixity, and workmen skilled in the manufacture of such things, and stewards who were in charge of these arms. Let us pass on to the aviary. I cannot possibly enumerate every kind of bird that was in it or describe its characteristics. There was everything from the royal eagle, smaller kinds of eagles, other large birds, down to multicolored little birds, and from those which they take the fine green feathers they use in their feather work. These last birds are about the size of our magpies, and here they are called quetzals. There were other birds too, which have feathers of 5 colors, green, red, white, yellow, and blue, but I do not know what they are called. Then there were parrots with different colored plumage, so many of them that I have forgotten their names. There were also beautifully marked ducks and bigger ones like them. At the proper season, they plucked the feathers of all these birds, which then grew again. All of them were bred in this aviary, and at hatching time, the men and women who looked after them would place them on their eggs and clean their nests and feed them, giving each breed of bird its proper food. In the aviary, there was a large tank of fresh water, and in it was another type of bird on long stilt legs with a red body, wings, and tail. I do not know its name, but in Cuba, birds rather like them are called ipiris. Also in this tank, there were many other kinds of water birds. Let us go on to another large house where they kept many idols, whom they call their fierce gods, and with them all kinds of beasts of prey, tigers, and 2 sorts of lion, and beasts rather like wolves, which they called adives. Bernal Diaz is mistaken here, is what the footnote says. This is an Arabic word for jackal, quite commonly used in Spain. And foxes and other small animals, all of them carnivores, and most of them bred there. They were fed on deer, fowls, little dogs, and other creatures which they hunt, and also on the bodies of the Indians they sacrificed, as I was told. I have already described the manner of their sacrifices. They strike open the wretched Indian's chest with flint knives, and hastily tear out the palpitating heart, which with the blood they present to their idols in whose name they have performed the sacrifice. Then they cut off the arms, thighs, and head, eating the arms and thighs at their ceremonial banquets. The head they hang up on a beam, and the body of the sacrificed man is not eaten, but given to the beasts of prey. They also had many vipers in this accursed house, and poisonous snakes, which have something that sounds like a bell in their tails. These, which are the deadliest snakes of all, they kept in jars and great pottery vessels full of feathers, in which they laid their eggs and reared their young. They were fed on the bodies of sacrificed Indians and the flesh of the dogs that they bred. We know for certain, too, that when they drove us out of Mexico and killed over 850 of our soldiers, they fed those beasts and snakes on their bodies for many days, as I shall relate in due course. These snakes and wild beasts were dedicated to their fierce idols and kept them company. As for the horrible noise when the lions and tigers roared, and the jackals and foxes howled, and the serpents hissed, it was so appalling that one seemed to be in hell. I must speak now of the skilled workmen whom Montezuma employed in all the crafts they practiced, beginning with the jewelers and workers in silver and gold, and various kinds of hollowed objects, which excite the admiration of our great silversmiths at home. Many of the best of them lived in a town called Azcapotzalco, 3 miles from Mexico. There were other skilled craftsmen who worked with precious stones and chalchihuites, and specialists in featherwork, and very fine painters and carvers. We can form some judgment of what they did then from what we can see of their work today. There are 3 Indians now living in the city of Mexico named Marcos de Aquino, Juan de la Cruz, and El Crespillo, who are such magnificent painters and carvers that had they lived in the age of the Apelles of old, or of Michelangelo or Bergette in our own day, they would be counted in the same rank. Let us go on to the women, the weavers and seamstresses, who made such huge quantity of fine robes with very elaborate feathers designs. These things were generally brought from some towns in the province of Cotaxtla, which is on the north coast, quite near San Juan de Ulua. In Montezuma's own palaces, very fine cloths were woven by these chieftains' daughters, whom he kept as mistresses, and the daughters of other dignitaries who lived in a kind of retirement like nuns in some houses close to the great quay of Huichulobos, wore robes entirely of feather work. Out of devotion for that god and a female deity who is said to preside over marriage, their fathers would place them in religious retirement until they found husbands. They would then take them out to be married. Now to speak of the great number of performers whom Montezuma kept to entertain him, there were dancers and stilt walkers, and some who seemed to fly as they leapt through the air, and men rather like clowns to make him laugh. There was a whole quarter full of these people who had no other occupation. He had as many workmen as he needed, too, stonecutters, masons, and carpenters, to keep his houses in repair. We must not forget the gardens with their many varieties of flowers and sweet-scented trees planted in order, and their ponds and tanks of fresh water into which a stream flowed at one end and out of which it flowed at the other, and the baths he had there, and the variety of small birds that nested in the branches, and the medicinal and useful herbs that grew there. His gardens were a wonderful sight, and required many gardeners to take care of them. Everything was built of stone and plastered, baths and walks and closets and rooms like summer houses where they danced and sang. There was so much to see in these gardens, as everywhere else, that we could not tire of contemplating his great riches and the large number of skilled Indians employed in the many crafts they practiced. When we had already been in Mexico for 4 days, and neither our captain nor anyone else had left our quarters except to visit these houses and gardens, Cortés said it would be a good thing to visit the large square of Tlatelolco and to see the great quay of Huichilobos. He also sent Aguilar, Doña Marina, and his own young page Ortagilla, who by now knew something of the language, to ask for Montezuma's approval of this plan. On receiving his request, the prince replied that we were welcome to go, but for fear that we might offer some offense to his idols, he would himself accompany us with many of his chieftains. Leaving the palace in his fine litter, when he had gone about halfway, he dismounted beside some shrines, since he considered it an insult to his gods to visit their dwelling in a litter. Some of the great chieftains then supported him by the arms, and his principal vassals walked before him, carrying 2 staves like scepters raised on high, as a sign that the great Montezuma was approaching. When riding in his litter, he had carried a rod, partly of gold and partly of wood, held up like a wand of justice. The prince now climbed the steps of the great quay, escorted by many papas, and began to burn incense and perform other ceremonies for Huichilobos. Let us leave Montezuma, who had gone ahead, as I have said, and return to Cortés and our soldiers. We carried our weapons, as was our custom, both by night and day. Indeed, Montezuma was so used to our visiting him armed that he did not think it strange. I say this because our captain and those of us who had horses went to Tlatelolco mounted, and the majority of our men were fully equipped. On reaching the marketplace, escorted by the many caciques whom Montezuma had assigned to us, we were astounded at the great number of people and quantities of merchandise, and at the orderliness and good arrangements that prevailed, for we had never seen such a thing before. The chieftains who accompanied us pointed everything out. Every kind of merchandise was kept separate and had its fixed place marked for it. Let us begin with the dealers in gold, silver, and precious stones, feathers, cloaks, and embroidered goods, and male and female slaves who are also sold there. They bring as many slaves to be sold in that market as the Portuguese bring negroes from Guinea. They are brought there attached to long poles by means of collars around their necks to prevent them from escaping, but others are left loose. Next, there were those who sold coarser cloth and cotton goods and fabrics made of twisted thread, and there were chocolate merchants with their chocolate. In this way, you could see every kind of merchandise to be found anywhere in New Spain, laid out in the same way as goods are laid out in the district of Medina del Campo, a center for fairs, where each line of stalls has its own particular sort. So it was in this great marketplace. There were those who sold sisal cloth and ropes and the sandals they wear on their feet, which are made from the same plant. All these were kept in one part of the market, and the place assigned to them, and in another part were skins of tigers and lions, otters, jackals and deer, badgers, mountain cats, and other wild animals, some tanned and some untanned, and other classes of merchandise. There were sellers of kidney beans and sage and other vegetables and herbs in another place, and in yet another they were selling fowls and birds with great dewlaps, and that says turkeys in the footnote. Also rabbits, hares, deer, young ducks, little dogs, and other such creatures. Then there were the fruiterers, and the women who sold cooked food, flour and honey cake, and tripe, and had their part of the market. Then came pottery of all kinds, from big water jars to little jugs displayed in its own place, also honey paste, and other sweets like nougat. Elsewhere they sold timber too, boards, cradles, beams, blocks, and benches, all in a quarter of their own. Then there were the sellers of the pitch pine for torches, other things of that kind, and I must also mention, with all apologies, that they sold many canoe loads of human excrement, which they kept in creeks near the market. This was for the manufacture of salt and the curing of skins, which they say cannot be done without it. I know that many gentlemen will laugh at this, but I assure them it's true. I may add that on all the roads they have shelters made of reeds or straw or grass so that they can retire when they wish to do so and purge their bowels unseen by passers-by, and also in order that their excrement shall not be lost. But why waste so many words on the goods in their great market? If I describe everything in detail, I shall never be done. Paper, which in Mexico they call amal, and some reeds that smell of liquid amber, are full of tobacco, and yellow ointments and other such things are sold in a separate part. Much cochineal is for sale too, under the arcades of that market, and there have been many sellers of herbs and other such things. They have a building there also in which 3 judges sit, and there are officials like constables who examine the merchandise. I am forgetting the sellers of salt and the makers of flint knives and how they split them off the stone itself, and the fisherwomen and the men who sell small cakes made of a sort of weed which they get out of the Great Lake, which curdles and forms a kind of bread which tastes rather like cheese. They sell axes too, made of bronze and copper and tin, and gourds and brightly painted wooden jars. We went on to the Great Quay, and as we approached its wide courts before leaving the marketplace itself, we saw many more merchants who, so I was told, brought gold to sell in grains, just as they extract it from the mines. This gold is placed in the thin quills of the large geese of that country, which are so white as to be transparent. They used to reckon their accounts with one another by the length and thickness of these little quills. How much so many cloaks or so many gourds of chocolate or so many slaves were worth, or anything else they were bartering. Now let us leave the market, having given a final glance, and come to the courts and enclosures in which their great quay stood. Before reaching it, you pass through a series of large courts, bigger, I think, than the plaza at Salamanca. These courts were surrounded by a double masonry wall and paved, like the whole place, with large smooth white flagstones. Where these stones were absent, everything was whitened and polished, and indeed the whole place was so clean there was not a straw or a grain of dust to be found there. When we arrived near the great temple, and before we had climbed a single step, the great Montezuma sent 6 papas and 2 chieftains down from the top, where he was making his sacrifices, to escort our captain as he climbed the steps, of which there were 114. They tried to take him by the arms to help him up in the same way as they helped Montezuma, thinking he might be tired, but he would not let them near him. The top of the quay formed an open square on which stood something like a platform, and it was here that the great stones on which they placed the poor Indians for sacrifice. Here also was a massive image, like a dragon, and other hideous figures, and a great deal of blood that had been spilled that day. Emerging in the company of 2 papas from the shrine, which houses its accursed images, Montezuma made a deep bow to us all and said, "My lord Malinche, you must be tired after climbing this great quay of ours." And Cortes replied that none of us was ever exhausted by anything. Then Montezuma took him by the hand and told him to look at his great city and all the other cities standing in the water, and the many others on the land around the lake. And he said that if Cortes had not a good view of the great marketplace, he could see it better from where he was now. So we stood there looking, because that huge accursed quay stood so high that it dominated everything. We saw the 3 causeways that led into Mexico, the causeway of Iztapalapa, by which we had entered 4 days before, and that of Tacuba, along which we were afterwards to flee on the night of our great defeat, when the new Prince Cuitlahuac drove us from that great city, as I shall tell in due course, and that of Tepeaquilla. It says Guadalupe in the footnote. We saw the fresh water which came from Chapultepec to supply the city, and the bridges that were constructed at intervals on the causeways so that the water could flow in and out from one part of the lake to the other. We saw a great number of canoes, some coming with provisions and others returning with cargo and merchandise. We saw, too, that one could not pass from one house to another of that great city and the other cities that were built on the water except over wooden drawbridges or by canoe. We saw quays and shrines in these cities that looked like gleaming white towers and castles, a marvelous sight. All the houses had flat roofs, and on the causeways were other small towers and shrines built like fortresses. Having examined and considered all that we had seen, we turned back to the great market and the swarm of people buying and selling. The mere murmur of their voices talking was loud enough to be heard more than 3 miles away. Some of our soldiers, who had been in many parts of the world, in Constantinople, in Rome, and all over Italy, said they had never seen a market so well laid out, so large, so orderly, and so full of people. But to return to our captain, he observed Father Bartolome de Olmedo, whom I had mentioned and who happened to be standing near him. It would be a good thing, I think, Father, if we were to sound Montezuma as to whether he would let us build our church here. Father Bartolome answered that it would be a good thing if it were successful, but he did not think this a proper time to speak of it, for Montezuma did not look as if he would allow such a thing. Cortes, however, addressed Montezuma through Doña Marina. Your lordship is a great prince, worthy of even greater things. We have enjoyed the sight of your cities, and since you are now here in your temple, I beg of you to show us your gods and Teules. Montezuma answered that first he would consult his chief papas, then when he had spoken to them, he said that we might enter a small tower, an apartment like a sort of hall, in which there were 2 altars with very rich wooden carvings over the roof. On each altar was a giant figure, very tall and very fat. He said that the one to the right was Huichilobos, their war god. He had very broad face and huge, terrible eyes, and there were so many precious stones, so much gold, so many pearls and seed pearls stuck to him with a paste which the natives made from a sort of root, that this whole body and head were covered with them. He was girdled with huge snakes made of gold and precious stones, and in one hand he held a bow, in the other some arrows. Another smaller idol beside him, which they said was his page, carried a sort of lance and a very rich shield of gold and precious stones. Around Huichilobos' neck hung some Indian faces and other objects in the shape of hearts, the former made of gold, the latter made of silver, and with many precious blue stones. There were some smoking braziers in their incense, which they call copal, in which they were burning the hearts of 3 Indians whom they had sacrificed that day. And all the walls of that shrine were so splashed and caked with blood that they and the floor, too, were black. Indeed, the whole place stank abominably. We then looked to the left and saw another great image of the same height as Huichilobos, with a face like a bear and eyes that glittered, being made of their mirror glass, which they call tescat. Its body, like that of Huichilobos, was encrusted with precious stones, for they said the 2 were brothers. This Tezcatlipoca, the god of hell, had charge of the Indians' souls, and his body was surrounded by figures of little devils with snakes' tails. The walls of the shrine were also so caked with blood, and the floor so bathed in it, that the stench was worse than that of any slaughterhouse in Spain. They had offered that idol 5 hearts from the day's sacrifices. At the very top of the quay was another alcove, the woodwork of which was very finely carved, and here there was another image, half man, half lizard, encrusted with precious stones, with half its body covered in a cloak. They said that the body of this creature contained the seeds in all the world, and that he was the god of seed time and harvest. I do not remember his name. It says in the footnote, this is probably Latacutli. Here, too, all was covered with blood, both walls and altar, and the stench was such that we could hardly wait to get out. They kept a very large drum there, and when they beat it, the sound was most dismal, like some music from the infernal regions, as you might say, and it could be heard 6 miles away. This drum was said to be covered with the skins of huge serpents. In that small platform there were many more diabolical objects, trumpets great and small, and large knives, and many hearts that had been burnt with incense before their idols, and everything was caked with blood. The stench here, too, was like a slaughterhouse, and we could hardly stay in the place. Our captain said to Montezuma, through our interpreters, with something like a laugh, Lord Montezuma, I cannot imagine how a prince as great and wise as your majesty can have failed to realize that these idols of yours are not gods, but evil things, the proper name for which is devils. But so that I may prove this to you and make it clear to all your papas, grant me one favor. Allow us to erect a cross here on top of this tower, and let us divide off part of this sanctuary where your Huichilobos and Tezcatlipoca stand, as a place where we can put an image of Our Lady. which image Montezuma had already seen. And then you will see, by the fear that your idols have of her, how grievously they have deceived you. Montezuma, however, replied in some temper, and the two papas beside him showed real anger. Lord Malinche, if I had known that you were going to utter these insults, I should not have shown you my gods. We hold them to be very good. They give us health and rain and crops and weather, and all the victories we desire. So we are bound to worship them and sacrifice to them, and I beg you to say nothing more against them. On hearing this and seeing Montezuma's fury, our captain said no more on the subject, but observed cheerfully, "It is time for your majesty and ourselves to depart." Montezuma replied that this was so, but that he had to pray and offer certain sacrifices on account of the great tatakul, that is to say, sin, which he had committed in allowing us to climb his great quay, and in being instrumental in letting us see his gods and the dishonor we had done them by our abuse. Therefore, before he left, he must pray and worship. "If that is so, my lord," Cortes answered, "I ask your pardon," and we went down the steps, of which there were 114, as I said. As some of our soldiers were suffering from pustules or running sores, their thighs pained them as they went down. I will now give my impression of the quay's surroundings. Do not be surprised, however, if I do not describe them as accurately as I might, for I had other thoughts in my head at the time than that of telling a story. I was more concerned with my military duties and the orders my captain had given me. But to come to the facts, I think the site of the great quay was equal to the plots of 6 large town houses at home. It tapered from the base to the top of the small tower where they kept their idols. Between the middle of this tall quay and its highest point, there were 5 holes like loopholes for cannon, but open and unprotected. But as there are many quays painted on the banners of the conquerors, including my own, anyone who has seen them can gather what a quay looked like from the outside. I heard a report that at the time when this great quay was built, all the inhabitants of that mighty city placed offerings of gold and silver and pearls and precious stones in the foundations, and bathed them in the blood of prisoners of war whom they had sacrificed. They also put there every kind of seed that grew in their country, so that their idols should give them victories and riches and great crops. Some curious readers may ask how we came to know that they had thrown gold and silver and precious chalchuhuites and seeds into the foundation of the quay and watered them with the blood of Indian victims, seeing that the building was erected 1,000 years ago. My answer is that after we conquered the great and strong city and divided the ground, we decided to build a church to our patron and guide St. James in place of Huitzilopochtli quay, and a great part of the site was taken for the purpose. When the ground was excavated to lay a foundation, gold and silver and chalchuhuites and pearls, seed pearls, and other precious stones were found in great quantities, and a settler in Mexico who built on another part of the site found the same. The officers of His Majesty's Treasury demanded this find as rightfully belonging to the king, and there was a lawsuit about it. I do not remember what the outcome was, only that they asked for information from the caciques and dignitaries of Mexico and from Cuauhtemoc, who was then alive, and they affirmed that all the inhabitants of Mexico had thrown jewels and other things into the foundation, as was recorded in their pictures and records of ancient times. The treasure was therefore preserved for the building of St. James Church. Let me go on to describe the great and splendid courts in front of Huitzilopochtli, on the site where that church now stands, which was called at the same time Tlatelolco. I have already said that there were 2 masonry walls before the entrance to the quay, and the court was paved with white stones like flagstones, and all was whitened, burnished, and clean. A little apart from the quay stood another small tower, which was also an idol house or true hell, for one of its doors was in the shape of a terrible mouth, such as they paint to depict the jaws of hell. This mouth was open and contained great fangs to devour souls. Beside this door were groups of devils in the shapes of serpents, and a little way off was a place of sacrifice, all blood-stained and black with smoke. There were many great pots and jars and pitchers in this house full of water, for it was here that they cooked the flesh of the wretched Indians who were sacrificed and eaten by the papas. Near this place of sacrifice there were many large knives and chopping blocks on those which men cut up meat in slaughterhouses, and behind that dreadful house, some distance away, were great piles of brushwood, beside which was a tank of water which was filled and emptied through a pipe from the covered channel that comes into the city from Chapultepec. I always called that building hell. Crossing the court, you came to another quay, where the great Mexican princes were buried. This also contained many idols and was full of blood and smoke. It too had doorways with hellish figures, and beside it was another quay, full of skulls and large bones, arranged in orderly fashion, and so numerous that you could not count them however long you looked. The skulls were in one place, and the bones in separate piles. Here there were more idols, and in every building or quay or shrine were papas in the long black cloth robes and long hoods. To proceed, there were other quays, a short distance away from that of the skulls, which contained other idols and sacrificial altars decorated with horrible paintings. These idols were said to preside over the marriages of men. But I will waste no more time on the subject of idols. I will only say that all round that great court were many low houses, used and occupied by the papas and other Indians who were in charge of them. On one side of the great quay there was another, much bigger pond or tank of very clean water, which was solely devoted to the service of Huichilobos and Tezcatlipoca. And the water for this tank was also supplied by covered pipes that came from Chapultepec. Nearby were the large buildings of a kind of nunnery, where many of the daughters of the inhabitants of Mexico dwelt in retirement until the time of their marriage. Here there were two massive female idols who presided over the marriages of women, and to which they offered sacrifices and feasts in order that they should get good husbands. I have spent a long time talking about the great quay of Tlatelolco and its courts. I will conclude by saying that it was the biggest temple in Mexico, though there were many other fine ones. For every 4 or 5 parishes or districts supported a shrine with idols. And since there were many districts, I cannot keep account of them all. I must say, however, that the great quay in Cholula was higher than that in Mexico, for it had 120 steps. The idol at Cholula, as I heard, had a great reputation, and people made pilgrimages to it from all over New Spain to obtain pardons. This was the reason why they had built it such a magnificent quay. It was differently planned from that of Mexico, but also had great courts and a double wall. The quay of the city of Texcoco was very high too, having 117 steps and fine wide courtyards, again of different shape from the others. Absurd though it was, every province had its own idols, and those of one province or city were of no help in another. Therefore they had an infinite number of idols, and sacrificed to them all. When we were all tired of walking about and seeing such a diversity of idols and sacrifices, we returned to our quarters, still accompanied by the many caciques and dignitaries whom Montezuma had sent with us. When our captain and the Mercedarian friar realized that Montezuma would not allow us to set up a cross at Huichilobos quay or build a church there, it was decided that we should ask his stewards for masons so that we could put up a church in our own quarters. For every time we had said Mass since entering the city of Mexico, we had to erect an altar on tables and dismantle it again. The stewards promised to tell Moctezuma of our wishes, and Cortés also sent our interpreters to ask him in person. Moctezuma granted our request and ordered that we should be supplied with all the necessary material. We had our church finished in 2 days, and a cross erected in front of our lodgings, and Mass was said there each day until the wine gave out. For as Cortés and some other captains and a friar had been ill during the Tlaxcalan campaign, there had been a run on the wine that we kept for Mass. Still, though it was finished, we still went to church every day and prayed on our knees before the altar and images, firstly, because it was our obligation as Christians and as a good habit, and secondly, so that Moctezuma and all his captains should observe us, and, seeing us worshipping on our knees before the cross, especially when we intoned the Ave Maria, might be inclined to imitate us. It being our habit to examine and inquire into everything, when we were all assembled in our lodging and considering which was the best place for an altar, 2 of our men, one of whom was the carpenter Alonso John Diaz, called attention to some marks on one of the walls which had been showed there had once been a door, though it had been well plastered up and painted. Now, as we heard that Montezuma kept his father's treasure in this building, we immediately suspected that it must be in this room, which had been closed up for only a few days before. Yáñez made the suggestion to Juan Velázquez de León and Francisco de Lugo, both relatives of mine, to whom he had attached himself as a servant, and they mentioned the matter to Cortés. So the door was secretly opened, and Cortés went in, first with certain captains. When they saw the quantity of golden objects, jewels, and plates and ingots which lay in the chamber, they were quite transported. They did not know what to think of such riches. The news soon spread to the other captains and soldiers, and very secretly we all went in to see. The sight of all that wealth dumbfounded me. Being only a youth at the time and never having seen such riches before, I felt certain that there could not be a store like it in the whole world. We unanimously decided that we could not think of touching a particle of it, and that the stones should be immediately replaced in the doorway, which we blocked again and cemented just as we had found it. We resolved also that not a word should be said about this until times changed, for fear Montezuma might hear of our discovery. Let us leave this subject of the treasure and tell how 4 of our valiant captains took Cortés aside in the church with a dozen soldiers who were in his trust and confidence, myself among them, and asked him to consider the net or trap in which we were caught, to look at the great strength of the city and observe the causeways and bridges, and remember the warnings we received in every town we passed through that Huichilobos had counseled Montezuma to let us into the city and kill us there. We reminded him that the hearts of men are very fickle, especially among the Indians, and begged him not to trust the good will and affection that Montezuma was showing us, because from one hour to another it might change. If he should take it into his head to attack us, we said, the stoppage of our supplies of food and water or the raising of any of the bridges would render us helpless. Then, considering the vast army of warriors he possessed, we should be incapable of attacking or defending ourselves. And since all the houses stood in the water, how could our Tlaxcalan allies come in to help us? We asked him to think over all we had said, for if we wanted to preserve our lives, we must seize Montezuma immediately, without even a day's delay. We pointed out that all the gold Montezuma had given us, and all that we had seen in the treasury of his father Axayacatl, and all the food we ate was turning to poison in our bodies, for we could not sleep by night or day, or take any rest with these thoughts in our minds. If any of our soldiers gave him less drastic advice, we concluded, they would be senseless beasts charmed by the gold and incapable of looking death in the eye. When he had heard our opinion, Cortés answered, "Do not imagine, gentlemen, that I am asleep or that I do not share your anxiety. You must have seen that I do. But what strength have we got for so bold a course to take as this great lord in his own palace, surrounded as he is by warriors and guards? What scheme or trick can we devise to prevent him from summoning his soldiers to attack us at once?" Our captains, Juan Velázquez de León, Diego de Ordaz, Gonzalo de Sandoval, and Pedro de Alvarado, replied that Montezuma must be got out of his palace by smooth words and brought to our quarters. Once there, he must be told that he must remain as a prisoner, and that if he called out or made any disturbance, he would pay for it with his life. If Cortés was unwilling to take this course at once, they begged him for permission to do it themselves. With 2 very dangerous alternatives before us, the better and more profitable thing, they said, would be to seize Montezuma rather than wait for him to attack us. Once he did so, what chance would we have? Some of us soldiers also remarked that Montezuma's stewards, who brought us our food, seemed to be growing insolent and did not serve us as politely as they had at first. 2 of our Tlaxcalan allies had, moreover, secretly observed to Jerónimo de Aguilar that for the last 2 days the Mexicans had appeared less well disposed to us. We spent a good hour discussing whether or not to take Montezuma prisoner and how it should be done. But our final advice, that at all costs we should take him prisoner, was approved by our captain, and we then left the matter till next day. All night we prayed God to direct events in the interests of his holy service. Next morning, two Tlaxcalan Indians arrived very secretly with letters from Villarrica containing the news of an attack by the Mexicans at a place called Almeria, in which one of our men and the constable's horse had been killed, as well as many Totonacs. Moreover, the constable Escalante himself and six more men had died of their wounds after returning to Villarrica. Now all the hill towns in Tempoala and its dependencies were in revolt. They refused to bring food or serve in the fort. Whereas hitherto our men had been respected as teules, now after this disaster Mexicans and Totonacs alike were behaving like wild beasts. They could not control the Indians in any way and did not know what measures to take. God knows the distress this news caused us. It was the first defeat we had suffered in New Spain, and misfortunes, as the reader will see, were now descending upon us. So that is the end of the chapter, The Stay in Mexico, from The Conquest of New Spain by Bernal Diaz. I will be producing more videos soon to help students in the bridge class for the Summer Learning Institute 2020 to be able to access the text in more ways than just by reading the text. So keep an eye out for future videos. In the meantime, thank you for listening, and I hope you watch the other videos soon.